Before we look at the questions on Sidney's apology, let us look at the summary, and that will help us to identify the topics. Hello, can you see the summary?
Yes, sir.
Alright, so it talks about the 7-part oration structure. A classical oration was divided by Cicero into 7 parts. So I have listed the 7 parts at the end of the summary. The first is entrance or exordium. Within bracket we have the Latin words. Second is narration or narratio, where actually the context of the oration is given. Third, exposition and definition, partitio. Basically the different divisions into which the subject will be discussed. Then proposition, propositio, which means argument. So the basic argument is laid bare in the proposition part. Confirmation or confirmatio, where the argument is established or proved. Confutation and refutation, this is part of confirmation actually. So by refuting the other people's objections, the author or the orator can prove or confirm his argument. Conclusion or epilogue, peroratio or peroration. But before this conclusion, after the confutation and refutation are over, there can be a digression which I have not mentioned here, but it is not strictly in the 7-part structure, but you may imagine that it is here before peroration. There may be or may not be a digression. It is optional. Okay, so we are as you can see that the summary itself is very long. The treatise is long, but we have finished it. We are just looking at the main points. So we have to remember that it is an apology, or it is a defense of poetry by Philip Sidney, and his argument is that poetry is the best of all the fine arts, and it is the most persuasive kind of teaching, and therefore he puts poetry in competition with other arts like philosophy and history or the more sciences, and then tries to prove that poetry is the best. So he gives a definition of poetry, as you remember, exposition and definition, partitio. So after exordium and narratio comes the partitio, and there Sidney gives the definition of poetry as an art of imitation that teaches its audience through delight or pleasure in its ability to embody ideas in compelling images. Poetry is like a speaking picture. Now, you can see that Sidney gives 2 definitions of poetry, not at the same time. At 2 different parts of the oration, he gives 2 different definitions, not very different, but 2 definitions. The first definition is Aristotelian, that it is an art of imitation, and teaches its audience through delight or pleasure. This is Horatian, that the Horatian idea of utile et dulce, delight and pleasure. Right. And a speaking picture, it is not strictly a definition, more of a description, which Sidney borrows from Italian critics. Then he speaks of the different parts of poetry. So that was the ancient custom of writing on any subject, that you divide the subject. That is also a kind of partition or partitio. You talk of the different parts. So he classifies poetry into 3 kinds, and discusses the all three kinds of poetry: religious poetry, poetry which uses only the verse form, and the actual poetry. So the whole thrust of his argument is that poetry is a more effective teacher of virtue than history or philosophy. He gives example from Virgil's Aeneid or Xenophon's Cydus. Then refutation, he reverts the criticisms made by musomizoi or poet haters. Sidney uses the Greek term musomizoi, hater of poets. So the accusation that poetry is a waste of time, that the poet is a liar, poetry corrupts our morals, all these accusations derive basically from Plato, who banished poets from the ideal city. So let us see how poetry, how Sidney defends poetry. So he defends poetry by first by praising poetry, that the poet is a prophet, making an etymological argument from the Latin word vates, which means a prophet, and then the Greek word poein, which means to make. So the word poet is derived from poein. So a poet means a maker. So the Greek word of poet is poietes, P-O-I-E-T-E-S, which means maker. So we see here Sidney's faith in etymology. Here translating the Greek word poietes literally allows Sidney to make a connection to the Judeo-Christian God, who was also a poetess, when he made the universe. So the Christian idea that God is a maker of this universe or creator of this universe, Sidney, by calling or reminding the readers that the poet is a maker, Sidney is kind of comparing the poet with God, the creator of this universe. But he makes a much bolder claim. He says that the poet goeth hand in hand with nature as an equal, so that the poet in a way rivals God on earth. And in fact, he goes on to say that the poet's creation of this world is superior to the natural world. As you may remember, that the poet that nature's world is made of bronze or brazen, but the poet's world is golden. So that argument suggests that a poet's creation is superior to God's creation or to this world. But Sidney has to make this argument very surreptitiously, in a very concealed manner, because otherwise it would sound blasphemous in the ears of Christian readers. So why does Sidney glorify poets so much? It is based upon the Renaissance philosophy of man. Pico della Mirandola, the Italian humanist, in his famous Oration on the Dignity of Man, he claims that humans are the best of God's creation because they most resemble God in their ability to participate in everything in nature. Then Sidney echoes ancient creation myths in Hesiod and Ovid and the Christian story of the fall when referring to a golden age. So the poet restores greatness that has been lost through human sinfulness. So in this argument, by this argument, Sidney is able to reconcile the fact that the poet's world, the poet's created world, appears to be superior to the natural world, because the natural world is a fallen world, but the poet restores one through imagination or inspiration to the golden world. The poet does not simply resemble God in making a second and more perfect nature. The poet is most like God in being able to make perfect people. According to traditional Christian theology, humankind is the highest and most perfect of God's creatures, because humans resemble God more than any other animals. So how does a poet make perfect people? By making fictitious characters in poetry. And Sidney gives the example of Xenophon, Cyrus, or such other great characters in literature, Virgil's Aeneas, and so on. So these characters are much more superior to any human being that can be found in the world. And therefore, a poet makes more perfect creatures or more perfect models. In choosing God's creation as the model for the poet's creative activity, Sidney implicitly genders this activity as male, as the creation of forms of ideas rather than the matter, which in the Aristotelian models of reproduction current in the Renaissance was gendered female. The God's creation is imagined to be male, and since the poet's creation is like that of God, therefore it is male. And what does God do? God creates forms or ideas and not matter. Similarly, a poet also creates forms or ideas. So this kind of creation is male or gendered as male, but there is another kind of creation. For example, women giving birth to children. So that is also creation. But since they give birth to what is matter, they give birth to body, therefore creation of bodies is considered female. So the two definitions of poetry, Horatian and Aristotelian. Poetry is an art of imitation, Aristotelian theory of mimesis. This is a representation or counterfeiting of reality. And Sidney uses the metaphor of a speaking picture. This idea of the goal of poetry is to teach and delight. This is Horatian. Then he speaks of three kinds of poetry: spiritual, philosophical, imaginative. So under spiritual comes religious poetry. Under philosophical comes natural philosophy, moral philosophy. In other words, every kind of science and arts apart from imaginative poetry, apart from imaginative literature. So any science or arts that proposes to teach some particular arts, that is under philosophical poetry. And imaginative poetry, any kind of imaginative literature, that is the real or actual poetry. So these are details of these three kinds of poetry. Comparison of poetry with the other arts to prove the superiority of poetry. That is also in quite great detail, how poetry is superior to history, how poetry is superior to any science, how poetry is superior to philosophy. Poetry is superior to history because history is bound to facts. History cannot alter or change facts. So the description of Cyrus by the historian is not as good as the description of Cyrus by Xenophon, because Xenophon represents an ideal man, an ideal prince, but an actual man can never be perfect. So the historical example of Cyrus is not better than that of Xenophon. How poetry is superior to philosophy? Philosophy teaches but philosophy cannot move. Poetry teaches, but it can also move the emotions. Therefore, it is superior. How poetry is superior to any other science, any other natural philosophy? Every natural philosophy or science is tied to a particular subject, a particular discipline. But poetry is not tied to any discipline or subject, it is entirely free. Therefore, it is superior to any other science. So, in this way, Sidney defines poetry as superior to history, philosophy, and all other sciences. Poetry deals with the universal, history deals with the particular. Sidney uses the terms from Aristotle: universal katharu, particular kathikastrom. The famed Cyrus of Aeneas is more doctrinable than the true Cyrus of Aeneas. Then the refutation section. And how does he refute Plato's charge? He refutes that with the help of Aristotle and Horace. Sidney cites Aristotle, who said that the goal of teaching is not knowledge but action, not gnosis but praxis. Therefore, there is a lot of emphasis on morality, because if the focus is on action, it means moral action. So the emphasis is on morality. Then the story of Menenius Agrippa, the story of the belly, the body, all parts of the body conspiring against the stomach. They ultimately end up starving themselves. So that is why Sidney suggests that poetry is the subject which teaches all doctrines. Sidney draws upon the language of sweetness used earlier to figure the poet as one who gives one a foretaste of the benefits of virtue through pleasurable stories of virtuous character and action. So this story of Menenius Agrippa is a parable which gives an example of the power of a story, or the power of a literature to teach something. So Menenius Agrippa uses this allegory to suggest that the head of the state, or the ruler of the state, should be accepted and should be taken care of, just as the stomach is the head of the principal organ of the body, which receives all food and then distributes it to everybody else. Similarly, the king, who receives taxes from people, distributes the wealth to everybody else. And the second story is of Nathan the prophet. God sent him to David to bring David back to faith, and Nathan told David an allegory about a man whose lamb was stolen from him. And Sidney says that the application was most true, but the discourse itself failed. So David reflected on his actions and returned to religion. So the metaphor, or the story, the parable, that is feigned, that is fictitious, but it teaches some real virtue. So that is the power of poetry, that is the power of literature. Sidney emphasizes that poetry draws the minds of its audience through something other than argumentation. It is able to move them through imagery to act virtuously in ways that philosophy and history cannot. Since it teaches virtue most effectively, it must be the best of the arts. Okay, so you have to remember these arguments of Sidney. Moving is a very strong argument that Sidney uses. Poetry is superior to other arts because it can move. And I told you that Rudolf Agricola, the rhetorician, had added moving with teaching and delighting as another quality of poetry. Then he tries to find out one by one which kind of poetry should be blamed, because he is defending the charge that poetry has become corrupt, immoral, and so it should be blamed, it should be banished. And he is taking up parts of poetry, that is, classifications of poetry. Is it the pastoral, is it the lyrical, is it the tragical or comical, and satire, epic. So he discusses all the parts and finds great virtue in these parts of poetry. So he uses his tactic of distinguishing between poetry as practiced in Elizabethan England and the ideal form of poetry as described in the Apology. So he agrees that yes, in Elizabethan England, some poems have, some poems are of lower quality, or some poets they cannot write well, but he distinguishes between the art of poetry and the actual practice of writing poetry. So he says that if people cannot practice properly, if they abuse the art, then the art cannot be blamed. Then he says that the second nature created by the poet is more perfect than God's nature. So as I just explained to you. Similarly, tragedy evokes admiration and commiseration. Tragic pity, fear, admiration for the hero, and therefore it teaches uncertainty in life. It scares the powerful, warns the kings about the dangers of tyranny, and so on. Then he talks about lyric poetry and praises virtue, moral precepts. Heroic poetry is, of course, the best kind of poetry. It gives us the ideal examples of conduct in the epic heroes. So some people are just haters of poetry, or they are poet weepers. So just as there are some people who are misogynist, who hate women, there are people who are misomuzoi, or who hate poets. Then he refutes the critics of poetry and the poet haters. Some writers like Erasmus in the praise of folly make absurd claims to attract the reader's attention to an important and non-intuitive argument, but generally critics of poetry are merely fools. So why are the critics of poetry fools? So Sidney says that the poet haters, they object to the abuse of verse. But even verse can be defended. It is a useful tool for memory. So Sidney has a lot to say on versification, on the art of memory, and so on. Then he refutes Plato with the aid of Aristotle and Horace. And the charge that poetry is the mother of lies is refuted by saying that the poet does not lie because he does not make any truth claim. Unlike historians or scientists, a poet does not say that what he is writing is true. On the other hand, he accepts that it is fiction. Everybody knows that poetry is fiction. Therefore, since he nothing affirmeth, therefore never lie. Therefore he cannot lie because he does not make any truth claim. And he also refuted Plato's banishment of poets by saying that Plato did not banish all poets because he himself wrote in a poetic style, and he was actually banishing those who made ill use or abuse of poetry by showing gods and goddesses in an evil way. Ideal subjects are provided by poetry, ideal characters, ideal themes, Sidney grants that poetry has much to do with love and lust, but this is not the fault of poetry itself, but rather of the people who write it. So it is the abuse of the art. Then he gives examples. He suggests that Plato's ideal republic is not actually a moral place. So Plato's critique of poetry should not be taken seriously. Another refutation of Plato, because Plato in the Republic speaks of communal use of women as property, which for the British people would appear to be very immoral. So Sidney says that if Plato suggests such immoral things himself, then his criticism of poetry cannot be accepted. Plato doesn't object to sexual immorality of poetry, which is what bothers Sidney's contemporaries, but rather to poetry's promotion of seemingly heretical ideas about the gods. But these only reflected commonly held beliefs in Greece and had nothing to do with poetry itself. So Plato meant to banish poets because they very effectively promoted ideas that he didn't like, which means that he actually believed in the power of poetry, and this indirectly praised it when banning poets from his republic. So Plato considered the poets to be a threat because he believed that they were very powerful. Okay, so Sidney turns the table on Plato and says that actually he is arguing that poetry is very powerful. And then there is the peroration or conclusion. There is the digression on English literature or the state of poetry in England, and we have some kind of appreciation of the earlier poets by Sidney, of Chaucer. Then from a neoclassical point of view, Sidney criticizes that kind of English drama where we see that the classical roots are flouted. And in this section of the apology, we actually cannot sympathize with Sidney or cannot support his arguments, because the greatest example of English drama in the Elizabethan period, Shakespeare, flouted all the neoclassical rules of writing. So here Sidney appears to be, a little conservative in his taste. But as I told you that Sidney theoretically supported, classical doctrines, but in practice he often did the opposite. He was actually a romantic poet, and even though he argues against mixing of genres, against writing in prose and verse in the same work, he exactly does the same in his Arcadia. He writes both in prose and verse. Therefore, we may not take this part of Sidney's argument very seriously. I suppose Sidney was only going with the, dominant classical tradition of that time, which was neoclassical tradition. Now, as it often happens that in any age, the critical theories, they do not always tally with the actual practice of poets of that time. So in England at the time, the romantic tradition of poetry was growing stronger and stronger, but the critical tradition was still, neoclassical. So we see this conflict, that as a poet Sidney is romantic, but when he writes as a critic, then he is neoclassical. So I suppose this summary will help you. Now if you want, you may look at the questions. Would you like me to discuss any particular question? Let me see, I have to choose it. Choose the question. How far does Sidney succeed in refuting the Puritan attack against poetry? How does he defend poetry? That is a very broad question which can't be answered in one word, because you will have to write the entire treatise in response to this question. I suppose this question will not come, but you may still try to answer how does he defend poetry by, the first part of the question, Puritan attack, here you have to speak about the attack by Stephen Gosson in his book the school of abuse by which he attacked poetry and drama, and therefore he dedicated this book to Sidney. So Sidney felt very embarrassed, and because he himself was a poet, so he had to somehow defend poetry, and he wrote this treatise or this apology. How does he defend poetry? He takes up the criticism of Plato, which is the central criticism of poetry. Plato banning the poets from his Republic created bad reputation for poets, and this global charge against poets that they are immoral, beginning from Greek poets, Homer and all others, because the poets represent gods and goddesses as lascivious, lustful, and so on, immoral, sinful. They are constantly chasing women or raping them. So Plato thought that this was heretic. Gods and goddesses cannot be like that. Now, when Plato was writing, then Greek religion was still alive. But when Sidney was writing, by that time it was long dead. So religion, when it appears to us, poetry of Homer or Hesiod, they do not appear to us as religious poetry. They are literature, imaginative poetry. But the Christian poets, the Christian writers, or even priests, since much of Christianity was borrowed from Platonism, therefore the question of morality was very important in Christianity as well. So Christian writers could also not support the pagan mythology, and it was a lifelong project of all Christian writers in the Renaissance to reconcile Christianity with paganism, and the best expression of paganism could be found in literature and arts. All right. Therefore, this kind of literature and art needed some defense, some support, some argument in their favor, and Sidney defends poetry by pleading that poetry is the greatest teacher among all the arts. And then he compares poetry to history, philosophy, other sciences, and so on and so forth. Then he says that it is the best teacher because it teaches. At the same time, it moves. The power of moving, the power of controlling the emotions, and guiding the emotions towards something better. So poetry has that power. So poetry can even lead one towards love of God. And this argument that poetry is an imitation of nature. So the first part of Sidney's argument in his defense is Aristotelian, that poetry is an imitation of nature, and yet it creates a nature which is much better than the original. So the imitation is better than the original. Something like modern, producers of Xerox machines or photocopying machines claim that the copy is better than the original. So why does Sidney claim that? Because Sidney says that in poetry the characters invented, or the fictional characters like Aeneas, like Cyrus, they are much superior to the actual historical characters. Because there is a lot of idealism in poetry, there is a lot of exposition of virtue in these heroes, in the epic heroes, and so on and so forth. So, based on Aristotle's theory of imitation, poetry leads to great creation of great characters, and imitation that gives us a world which is superior to the natural world. So this part of defense is based upon Aristotle's theory of imitation. The second part of the defense is based upon Horace's argument that poetry teaches as well as is delightful. And I told you already about that, how poetry teaches and also moves, the rhetorical force of poetry, the ability to control people's emotions and guide them towards something good. So that is the broad framework of Sidney's defense, and then refuting the arguments that poetry is bad by saying that actually the writers are bad. The poets are inferior in English at that time. They cannot create as great literature as the Greek and Roman poets. They are inferior. And then he takes up all the subgenres of poetry, or the classification of poetry: pastoral, lyric, epic, comic, tragedy, satire, and so on and so forth, and shows that each of them has a lot of virtue, and each of these parts of poetry they teach very well, and therefore there is nothing in poetry, no part in poetry that is harmful. On the other hand, each of them teaches virtue very well. He also refutes Plato by saying that Plato himself wrote in a poetic style, that he banned only poets who wrote in a manner which depicted gods as lustful and so on, immoral. But he did not ban all poets or all poetry. So these are the broad frameworks of Sidney's defense of poetry. Is it clear? Okay. And then the rest of the questions, you see, discuss the refutation part of Sidney's apology. So you just focus on that part of the apology and you can discuss that. Comment on definitions of poetry. So these questions, they all focus on a particular part of the apology, unlike the first question, which was very broad, covering the entire apology. Discuss Sidney's idea of mimesis, again one part. Is it Platonic or Aristotelian? This question will not come. I have said it so that you know the difference between the two. Platonic idea of mimesis was that God has the original ideas in God's mind, the ideas, they are the truth. The world is a reflection of those ideas or imitation of those ideas. So that is Platonic theory of mimesis. The world imitates God's ideas. And Aristotelian theory of mimesis does not say anything about God's idea or God's mind. It says that literature is an imitation of reality. In literature, the poets imitate reality or reflects reality. That is Aristotelian mimesis, and which mimesis Sidney talks about in this apology. Basically Aristotelian. Okay. How does Sidney use ancient sources to prove the superiority of poetry and humanist learning? Okay, so that you can refer to all the Greek and Roman writers that Sidney refers to. They are the ancient sources. Sidney refers to a lot of Greek and Roman writers, and that proves that he was trained in the humanist manner, because the humanists read a lot of classical literature, Greek and Roman literature. Comment on Sidney's use of the oration structure in the apology. That is also very simple. The 7-part oration of Cicero, beginning with exordium or introduction, then narratio or narration, which is the context, then propositio or proposition, which is the argument, partitio, division of arguments, then refutation. The actual greatest part of the oration is confirmation, and under confirmation there is refutation. Sometimes there may be a digression. Here there is a digression when Sidney speaks about English poetry, and then peroration or conclusion. So we see these parts and the oration structure here. Sidney develops a logical frame of argument. This question will not come. there is a logical development in Sidney's argumentation. If you just arrange his arguments one after another, you can see that there is a logical development. Sidney uses etymology to argue in poetry's favor. There are many examples. For example, the use of the word artist or prophet, the use of the Greek word poem and poetess or maker. How, according to Sidney, poetry is superior to history? It is very easy. History is bound to facts. Poetry is not bound to facts, but poetry idealizes character. Therefore, it can present a character full of virtues, which is not possible in reality. Where does poetry stand in comparison to philosophy? Philosophy teaches some knowledge. Philosophia means love of knowledge. Every science, every philosophy in the Renaissance was divided into two parts: natural philosophy, which means the sciences; moral philosophy, which means ethics. So every philosophy teaches a particular subject. So Sidney says that these are tied to a particular question or theme. So their arguments run in the circle of a question. However, poetry is not tied to any particular subject. Therefore, it is completely free, independent, and the argument is not tied to anything. Therefore, poetry is much superior to philosophy. But another argument, Sidney says that philosophy can teach well, but it cannot move like poetry. Poetry can teach as well as move. Therefore, poetry is superior. What does Sidney have to say on English drama? He basically is unhappy with English drama because there are many mixture of genres. Tragicomedy, he calls it mongrel tragicomedy. He is against mixture of genres, and he speaks of the three unities, the neoclassical three unities: unity of time, place, and action. And he finds that these are lacking in English plays mostly. So time is not limited to 12 hours or 24 hours, but sometimes there might be a 20-year gaps in between two parts of a play. The scene can now be London, now be Venice, now be Rome, now be Egypt. Therefore, there is no unity of place, and therefore basically he is unhappy with English drama. And this will to some extent satisfy Stephen Gosson, who argued that drama was bad. But Gosson argued drama was bad on the basis of a moral argument, that drama had become immoral. Sidney's argument that English drama at present is bad is based on an aesthetic argument that these plays do not follow the neoclassical rules. So they do not match. Sidney does not actually support Gosson at all. What are the three kinds of poetry? Spiritual or religious poetry, philosophical or poetry on any particular subject, and actual poetry or imaginative poetry. What is Sidney's opinion about the heroic or epic poetry? It is the highest kind of poetry. It presents heroic characters who have all the virtues, and therefore it can teach us all the virtues and can inspire us in emulating the virtues of the epic heroes. What arguments does Sidney make concerning the unity of plays? I have already discussed. What is Sidney's opinion about the heroic or epic poetry? You have to just look at that particular section of Apology where Sidney is praising heroic poetry and epic poetry. As far as I remember, he says that epic poetry is without question the best kind of poetry. Traditionally it has been praised as the highest kind of poetry in classical times, in Greek times, and even in the Renaissance it was held to be the best kind of poetry. Even though tragedy is considered very sophisticated and noble, but epic poetry was always considered the highest kind of poetry. And what are the reasons? The reason is that the heroic suggests that the characters, they have heroism they have virtues of a hero, and all these virtues are what emulating. Sidney gives examples of Cyrus in Xenophon, of Aeneas in Virgil, of Orlando in Ariosto, and says that the virtues of these characters are worth emulating or worth imitating, and at the same time the passions of the characters, they also move us. He gives the example of Dido and how Aeneas leaves Dido because he has been told by Apollo to move on, and even though Dido is crestfallen, Aeneas moves on without thinking twice. So that shows his heroism. He is not tied to his love, but he is more tied to his duty. So Sidney cites such noble examples from heroic poetry, and his opinion is extremely high about heroic poetry, and the great quality of heroic poetry helps him support the argument that poetry teaches virtue as well as moves us thoroughly and inspires us to emulate these virtues. Is clear?
Yes, sir. Thank you.